right. Hello, good morning. Beautiful. I will get started right away. Appreciate it. I said this would be an explanation of the woke right and all business, no personal, but I did spend 3 hours at a Verizon store yesterday. Anybody want to hear that story? I doubt it. My goodness. First world problems, right? But my God. Okay. So, what I'm going to do thank you for joining me, by the way. What I'm going to do is explain critical race theory, explain the framework into which critical race theory sits, which you can think of as the four categories of racial policy, potential perspectives on racial policy. I'm going to argue that there is such a thing as the woke right. I'm going to acknowledge their grievances, which is going to make sense after I explain what critical race theory is. I'm going to tell you why I think they're wrong, the woke right, despite the fact that I hate critical race theory. And I'm going to then distinguish the woke right from MAGA. And then I'm going to get the hell out of here and let you go. So I expect this to be 15 minutes maybe. And then I'll take a couple questions at the end if anybody has any. So let's get into critical race theory. So I studied this in law school in 2021 into 22. In my final year of law school, I took 2 courses back to back. Amazing professor, blah, blah, blah. You've heard it a million times. But what is critical race theory? Well, it starts with this idea of anti-objectivity. So think back to the 1980s, 1990s. I wasn't born, or I was very little, but we all refer to that as this time where colorblind was the norm in society, right? You just didn't hear this race stuff, right? That's what I always hear. It just wasn't a thing. I mean, it seems like we were beyond racism in America. So we have this colorblind norm since the Civil Rights Act, right? We no longer see race in this country, and we finally got to a good place, it felt like. But the critical race theorists came around and said, no, even though we have a colorblind society legally in the Constitution on paper, in effect, if you look in the statistics and if you look in reality on the streets, we really have a racially non-neutral society, a society that is frankly built and designed for white people, which if you're not white, you might get lucky and you might be able to assimilate into this culture. But what if you don't? What if you just don't fit into that culture? And this is the argument from the critical race theorists, that yes, there are minority black voices that are conservatives, the Thomas Sowells, the Clarence Thomases, etc. But and this is the argument straight from the law school professor, who is a distinguished Yale scholar, older black gentleman. So I'm not making this stuff up. I got it straight from the source. He says, no, the majority black view in terms of what black culture is that there is a black culture. It's different from white culture. The mainstream culture in America is white. And so while there are some people that can assimilate, it's really fucked up to ask the majority black culture to assimilate into America. And so the burden needs to be on the system to change then into something that is suitable for everybody. In this case, we're talking about black people, but you could apply this critical perspective to any traditionally marginalized group. So we live in a colorblind society, but actually that locks in racial injustice is the starting point for these critical race theorists. And if you dig a little deeper into it, you get to this understanding that private property and minimal government posture, those are like the 2 planks of traditional American culture, right? Certainly conservative perspective, but that's probably a fair assessment, right? Private property, minimal government. The critical race theorist says that is a white system. Those are white values. And so you could see why people would think that white culture or American culture is under attack. It's very, very controversial. And I had a very adverse reaction to study again. And this is what launched my search for political identity. And I ended up voting for Trump. And here we are. Now, let me take a sip of tea before I go on. So that's critical race theory in a nutshell. Society is not neutral. The values that make up American culture as we understand it are white values. And that needs to be, and this is very important, And that needs to be radically transformed into something that is suitable for people of all races. So it's the and part that people sometimes forget, because people say, oh, critical race theory is just history. Well, okay, if it was just you saying, I think the history, including very recent history, is extremely racist, okay, maybe you can make that argument, but it's not just that. It's and we got to radically transform the system. So it's very controversial, because it's basically saying the Constitution is a white document still to this day. Obviously, it was in the very, very beginning, but it needs to be undone. So I mean, I just took an oath. I'm a licensed attorney in California. I just swore an oath to the Constitution. So you can see that's why this made me uncomfortable. Okay, so that's critical race theory. I hope everyone's clear about that, and I haven't seen any comments, so hopefully everyone's clear. 4 categories, though, of how you could look at racial policy in America. This is also straight from the courses that I took. You have traditionalism, you have reformism, you have critical race theory, and you have limited separation. So a traditionalist is someone who thinks that the norm in society as it pertains to race relations should be colorblind. Everything is great. The Civil Rights Act was the peak achievement. It was the culmination of the effort for racial injustice. We solved the problem. We achieved the colorblind society. Let's stay there. That's the traditionalist view. The reformist says, yes, while we should still have a colorblind norm as the dream goal, we have to acknowledge that we're not quite there yet, and we should have some racially sensitive, racially aware DEI, affirmative action type policies on the fringes of society. We should do some tweaking. We should be open to until we achieve sufficient integration, you might say, assimilation, racial justice, social equity, and then we will go back to being colorblind. That's reformism. So remember, it was traditionalist, reformism, and then critical race theory, which I just described to you, which my professor often described as critical race theory, reformism on steroids. We got to tear it down and rebuild it. The deconstruction. You know how at the bartenders would serve deconstructed cocktails. You get a deconstructed cannoli at dinner. It's trendy to deconstruct things. Well, that's kind of what critical race theory is. We got to deconstruct this American system, because again, it's a white system, and it's just unfair to expect non-white people to have to fit into it. Okay, so the last category is called limited separation. And what my professor said was that he told us Derek Bell, one of the founders of critical race theory, I think he was a Harvard professor, right? Distinguished scholar, created critical race theory. Apparently, on his deathbed, was lamenting the fact that critical race theory had not been accepted by mainstream culture. It had not achieved critical mass. The only way critical race theory could actually have an impact is if the mainstream white culture said, you know what, you're right, we need to change. And that didn't happen. And so he began to advocate for something late in his life called limited separation, which is going to sound like segregation, but it was clearly explained in the class that it's not, and it isn't, but it's eerily close, right? So it's kind of interesting. My reaction was very, again, adverse to learning about limited separation. But on the other hand, if you're just talking about groups, ethnic groups, or groups that have a lot in common, coming together and supporting each other, well, there are positive examples like the Jewish community, right? Some ethnic communities really do bond together, and so you don't want to discourage that. But so you have traditionalism, reformism, critical race theory, and then limited separation says, okay, what we should do is have separate institutions that are majority, not all, majority, at least 51% Black in the case of critical race theory. Hospitals, whatever, go down the line, government buildings, post offices, all these things. If we're not getting the care or dignity, respect, or fairness that we deserve from the mainstream institutions, we're going to have our own institutions, and that's basically it. And as long as Each institution retains at least 51% Black population, then anyone's allowed in. So it's so okay, like wow, right? I'm just like, this is crazy. So yes, this all blew my mind. I started the podcast, talked to a lot of people, and ended up voting for Trump because, like, Harris, she just didn't have a lot going for her, and I'm not sure that she's could have done much better in other circumstances. So now what I want to do is acknowledge well, no, I want to argue that there is such a thing as the woke right. Okay, here we go. Here's probably the most important part. I'm glad I made a little agenda. Whew. So if the woke left is these people in the class that I took and the professor saying that American society is designed for white people, that's the woke left, right? And they say therefore you got to change it. Well, I'm saying there's a woke right. Are there not a group of people that say that America is designed only for white people on the right? But they say something different after that. They don't want to change it. They want to kick the non-white people out. That's the woke right. America is designed for white people. That's woke. And it's just a matter of what they want to do with it. So, yeah, I acknowledge that if you want to call mainstream, look, do I want to call mainstream American culture today white culture? How I answer that is, well, it certainly derives from white culture. Absolutely. As I said to someone recently, our founding fathers didn't come from Africa. So it's fine to say that. We have adapted and modernized America to make it fit. And the question is, do you think anybody can achieve success here? Obviously, the world isn't a perfect place. But do you think there are barriers today, racial barriers, that need to be dismantled further? Or did we already achieve that? So I acknowledge the attack. So is America white? Well, that's what I just said. Is that culture under attack? It is definitely under attack from these critical race theorists. So whether you want to call it white culture or American culture, it's under attack. So I get that, guys. This is why I voted for Trump. This is why I started the damn podcast. I said, what is this? I come from the left, but what is this narrative about oppression by race today? Really? And it pissed me off because it's like, have I been that ignorant? And so far, I've just been doubling down and saying, I hope it's not a case of me just being really that ignorant, because I really don't know. So it was interesting. In the class, there was one Black student, and he was actually the one other kid among 40 people who, like me, was drifting to the right the more we learned the material. And he was on his way to be a prosecutor. He was like, I'm going to join the system. All right, moving this along, and then I'll get to some questions if there are any. So yes, I acknowledge that the American system, which derives itself from a white culture for sure, is under attack from leftist narratives. But the answer is not to kick all the non-white people out. It's to return to the race-neutral norm. So MAGA are traditionalists in this equation. The woke right are the groypers. MAGA are not woke because they don't believe that American culture is designed only for white people. They believe that American culture is the best culture in the world and that anyone can thrive here, and that the critical race theorists need to shut the hell up or get the hell out, because you're tearing down the fabric of our nation and you're creating a victim mindset where it's absolutely not appropriate. Does that make sense? I think I might have said everything I want to say, other than, well, let me just do my closing then. America does have white roots. Nothing wrong with acknowledging that. If you, like I do, you believe that this is the greatest country in the world, then you got to say, hey, like, good on. Now, obviously, America was born of sin, tremendous sin, and it took a lot of suffering and work on the part of real social justice warriors to get us to a point where American society is open to everybody. and the founders weren't perfect. But if you look at it holistically, if you're like me, you get to a point where you appreciate what our culture is and where it came from. And it's okay to acknowledge that it came from white people and that they were imperfect, though obviously brilliant. And it's perfectly appropriate to expect immigrants to assimilate, period, just as a comment. But that doesn't mean that America is for whites only. I mean, is this hard? Right? Lastly, if you're going to make an argument that legal immigration is bad for the American worker, legal immigration, if you're going to make an argument that legal immigration is bad for the American worker, then don't be a racist or an anti-Semite or full of hate when you make the argument, because it distracts from the argument. And this is what I'm talking about, the woke right. When the H-1B visa issue came out, how many racist things did you see? Oh, and against Indians, and the Jews are replacing all the workers. You know, this is the work of the Jews. So it's like, that's what I don't find interesting or substantive. But what I do find interesting is the Bernie Sanders version of that argument, which is no racism, no anti-Semitism, but just look at the perspective of the American worker. So I don't know how good those arguments are about legal immigration or the H-1B issue specifically, but if you're an asshole and if you're woke about it, if you make it about race, then you're not doing yourself any favors, at least in my book. So any comments or questions before I say au revoir? I think I can see him. Austin, appreciate you, man. All right. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Appreciate you. Take care.